Do you fear storms, earthquakes, or wars? You shouldn't. The most ruthless killer in human history weighs less than a speck of dust and is invisible to the naked eye. It doesn't pick sides, it takes no prisoners, and it never signs peace treaties. It hides in a flea's bite, a drop of blood, or a neighbor's simple exhale. Today, we look into the faces of the 7 invisible horsemen of the apocalypse that nearly sent our species into extinction. Get ready. After this, a common cold will feel like a personal threat. We begin the chronicle of the Great Annihilation.
This is Red Doctrine. We've only just begun and the darkness is closing in. Make sure to subscribe and hit that like button so you don't miss the conclusion. Your support keeps us digging into history's grimmest chapters. Let's keep moving. Smallpox in the New World 2020s, the biological vanguard. Total deaths, 56 million. When the conquistadors set foot on the lands of the Aztecs and Incas, they brought a weapon that no suit of armor could stop. Smallpox, the Great Rash, became the invisible vanguard of colonization. It killed approximately 90% of the indigenous population, effectively clearing the path for European empires. The armies of great civilizations fell not just to steal, but because their warriors were too weak to hold a spear. Imagine thriving metropolises turning into ghost towns in a matter of weeks. The Incas believed their gods had turned against them as they watched their loved ones covered in agonizing pustules. This virus erased culture, knowledge, and history of an entire continent, leaving only ruins and silent jungles. The death toll was so massive, it caused a temporary cooling of the planet's climate as abandoned farmlands reverted to forest. The Spanish Flu, 1918 to 1920. The hunger for young hearts. Total deaths, 50 million. As the guns of World War I finally fell silent in 1918, humanity breathed a sigh of relief. But the joy was short-lived. A new killer was already creeping through the trenches and troop ships. The Spanish flu infected 1/3 of all humanity, roughly 500 million people. Its primary cruelty lay in a paradox. Unlike the typical flu, it spared the elderly and targeted the strongest, healthiest, and youngest. It triggered a cytokine storm. The victim's immune system worked so violently, it destroyed its own lungs. People turned blue from a lack of oxygen and died of suffocation within hours. At the height of the pandemic, theaters and schools were converted into wards, and coffins ran out, forcing the dead into mass graves. In 2 years, the virus killed more people than the entire Great War. The Plague of Justinian, 541 AD, the shattered dream of empire. The Byzantine Empire was at the height of its power when grain ships from Egypt docked in Constantinople. Along with food, they brought death. This was the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague in history. At its peak, 5,000 people were dying every single day in the capital alone. Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague, but narrowly survived, unlike millions of his subjects. Massive pits for bodies filled up instantly, and corpses were stacked inside the towers of the city walls, creating an unbearable stench of decay that hung over the city for months. The economy collapsed, the army vanished, and Justinian's grand plans to restore the Roman Empire turned to ash. This pandemic acted as the gateway to the Dark Ages, weakening Europe so severely that it could not resist invasions for centuries to come.
HIV/AIDS, 1981 to present. The Invisible Siege. In 1981, doctors in the U.S. encountered mysterious cases of rare infections in young men. This was the dawn of a pandemic that, officially, has never ended. The human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, is a cunning enemy. It doesn't kill instantly, but slowly dismantles the body's defenses, leaving it helpless against even a common cold. Over 40 years, AIDS has claimed more than 40 million lives, turning into a social and economic tragedy, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Today, 40 million people live with this diagnosis. It is the pandemic of our time, one that taught us that science is the only weapon capable of holding back a virus. Despite the creation of antiretroviral therapy, which turned death into a chronic condition, treatment remains out of reach for many, and the shadow of this horseman still looms over the planet. The Cocoliztli epidemic, 1545, the bloody reign of Mexico. In 1545, as the indigenous people of Mexico were still reeling from smallpox, a new horror arrived. Cocoliztli means pestilence in the Aztec language. The symptoms were nightmarish. The victims bled from their eyes, nose, and mouth. Their skin turned yellow, and their bodies were consumed by an insane fever. In just 3 years, the virus destroyed up to 80% of the remaining population. It behaved much like modern-day Ebola in its ferocity. Historians argued over the cause for centuries until modern genetics found traces of salmonella in the victims' remains. The epidemic ignited after a catastrophic drought when the population was already starving. Mexico became a massive burial ground. Even the Spanish colonizers were terrified. They watched Aztec families vanish in days, leaving nothing but bloodstains on the floors of their huts. The Third Plague Pandemic, 1855 to 1960, the final blow. The plague returned one last time in the mid-19th century, starting in the Yunnan province of China. It lasted over a century, slowly crawling along trade routes to Hong Kong, India, and eventually the Americas. In India alone, it claimed over 10 million lives. However, this pandemic gave humanity the chance to strike back. In 1894, in Hong Kong, scientist Alexandra Yersin finally discovered the bacterium, and later its carriers, fleas. This discovery ended medieval superstitions and gave birth to modern epidemiology. Even though we have learned to treat the plague with antibiotics, it still lives in natural reservoirs, reminding us that man's oldest enemy never truly leaves. It is simply waiting for its moment to return. The Black Death, 1347 to 1353. The Apocalypse in real time. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys pulled into the harbor of Messina. On the decks lay corpses. The few survivors begged for death, their bodies covered in oozing charcoal black buboes. This was the beginning of the end. In just 6 years, the Black Death wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population. Cities became open-air morgues where the living simply couldn't bury the dead fast enough. The culprit wasn't divine wrath, but the bacterium Yersinia pestis, hitching a ride on fleas living on black rats. The social order shattered. Parents abandoned their children, and priests barricaded themselves in cells. The world literally emptied out. Entire villages vanished, leaving behind only hollow houses and the whistling wind. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in history, permanently altering the genetic code of humanity.